History is not only the tale of empires that rose and fell, but also of small nations that endured. Among the mountains and seas of the Far East lies a land often overlooked in the chronicles of the West. A peninsula, both fortress and prison, where survival demanded more than strength. It required resilience, patience, and faith. This is Korea, known in legend as Joseon, the land of the morning calm. But calm was rarely its fate. From the myth of Dangun and the first kingdom of Joseon, through centuries of wars between Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, to the brilliance of Goryeo Celadon and the long reign of Joseon, the Korean people forged a civilization both fragile and enduring, scarred by invasions, yet radiant in culture. To the casual player of a video game or the viewer of a historical drama, Korea may seem only a realm of armored war wagons and turtle ships, of kings in silk robes and courtiers in Confucian halls. Yet behind those images lies a deeper story of a people who turned hardship into strength, who built beauty amid ruins, and who left the world a gift of resilience and creativity. This journey, then, is not merely about battles and dynasties. It is about how a civilization survived the storm of history and still sings today in its language, its art, and its unyielding spirit. Let us begin and listen to the voice of Joseon. If geography is destiny, then few nations have borne their geography more heavily or more faithfully than Korea. Look at the map. A slender peninsula thrusting out between two giants, China to the west, Japan to the east. Its body shaped by mountains, its lungs filled with salt air, its spirit tempered by harsh winters and humid summers. Nearly 70% of this land is mountain, not the gentle hills of Tuscany or the fertile plains of the Nile, but stern ridges and granite walls. Forests that climb skyward, valleys that hem villages in tight embrace. To the north, the Yalu and Tumen rivers form borders that were never secure. To the south and east, the sea has been both lifeline and menace. A people born here could never afford to be careless. Survival itself was the first teacher. The mountains imposed both hardship and protection. They limited the spread of great cities, scattering communities into small valleys where soil was scarce and precious. Farmers carved rice paddies into the hillsides like green stairways to heaven, their sweat watering every terrace. Yet those same mountains were walls against invaders, slowing the march of foreign armies, giving Koreans time to regroup, to resist, to endure. And the seas, how they ruled the imagination. On one hand, they connected Korea to the trade routes of China and Japan, carrying silk, ceramics, and ideas across waves. On the other, they brought pirates, raiders, and the looming threat of conquest. In every crashing tide, Koreans must have heard both promise and peril. Climate, too, conspired to mold a resilient people. Winters on the peninsula can be bitter, with winds howling down from Siberia, freezing rivers and hardening the soil. Summers, by contrast, bring monsoon rains, sudden floods, and heavy humidity. The seasons themselves were a discipline: to plant in time, to harvest quickly, to prepare for cold months of scarcity. Life in such a land taught patience, diligence, and the art of making the most of little. It is no accident that later, in chronicles of their neighbors, Koreans were often described as hardy, stubborn, and indomitable. Nature had trained them to be so. But geography does more than dictate labor. It shapes imagination. A people surrounded by mountains tend to look inward, cherishing the bonds of community and family. A people bounded by seas tend to be wary of strangers, yet never wholly isolated. The peninsula was a paradox, cut off and connected, vulnerable and fortified, small yet fiercely independent. Out of this paradox grew a culture deeply conscious of its fragility and its endurance. It is here that legend begins. Koreans traced their origin not merely to soil and stone, but to the heavens themselves. They told of Dangun, the divine founder, born of a heavenly prince and a bear transformed into a woman through patience and prayer. Such myths reveal the heart of a nation. The bear, enduring hunger and darkness in a cave until she achieved human form, became the mother of a people who would likewise endure trial after trial and emerge stronger. To live in this land was already to be part of a mythic struggle, and each generation inherited the bear's endurance. For the outsider, this landscape may seem austere, even forbidding. Yet to the Korean eye, the mountains were sacred, their peaks homes to spirits and gods. To this day, Buddhist temples perch halfway up forested slopes, their bells echoing like whispers of eternity. Streams and waterfalls were not mere water. They were veins of life, binding heaven and earth. The landscape itself became scripture, and Koreans, its faithful readers. If one seeks a reflection of this spirit in modern culture, one might look at the visual poetry of the historical drama Kingdom. In its sweeping shots of frozen valleys and misty ridges, one glimpses the same truth: that the land itself is a character in the story, shaping destinies, testing the resilience of its people. The beauty is stark, but never gentle. It commands respect, as the Korean character itself commands respect. And yet, hardship breeds not only resilience, but creativity. Limited farmland forced innovations in irrigation, rice cultivation, and terraced fields. Scarcity inspired frugality, but also artistry. Every tool, every garment, every vessel was made to last and made with care. The same mountains that confined communities also preserved them, allowing dialects, customs, and traditions to develop with distinct flavor. Thus, the harshness of the land became the richness of the culture. From the vantage point of history, one might say Korea's fate was sealed by its geography. Sandwiched between greater powers, vulnerable to both land and sea invasions, its people could not hope to dominate their neighbors. Instead, they learned to survive them. The mountains taught endurance, the seas taught vigilance, and the climate taught discipline. The very constraints of the land forged a civilization not expansive, but enduring, not loud, but profound. Here, then, is the paradox of Korea's beginning. A small peninsula, hard to till, easy to invade, yet never conquered in spirit. Out of mountains and seas, out of hardship and scarcity, grew a people whose resilience would astonish their enemies, and whose culture would shine long after empires around them fell into dust. Before we speak of kingdoms and dynasties, before we recall kings and generals, we must first listen to the voice of the land itself. For in Korea, more than anywhere, the land is the first king, and its people, faithful subjects of stone and wave. Every civilization begins not only with the soil beneath its feet, but with the stories it tells about its birth. For Korea, that story begins in the twilight of myth, with the tale of Dangun, the son of heaven and of endurance itself. According to legend, Hwanung, a celestial prince, descended to earth to rule over men. A tiger and a bear, longing to become human, prayed for transformation. Only the bear succeeded. By enduring 100 days of seclusion and surviving on nothing but garlic and mugwort. From her patience came humanity, and from her union with Hwanung was born Dangun, the founder of the first Korean kingdom, Joseon, in 2333 BCE. It is a myth both simple and profound. In the bear's trial, one sees the archetype of Korean history: long-suffering, patient endurance, rewarded not by conquest, but by transformation. The tiger, fierce but restless, failed. The bear, humble and steadfast, prevailed. Out of this myth grew a national identity that valued perseverance over power, patience over pride. To Koreans, their civilization was not born of accident, but of sacrifice and discipline. Behind the poetry lies history. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the first millennium BCE, communities in northern Korea and Manchuria had organized themselves into tribal confederations. These early societies cultivated millet and rice, domesticated animals, and worked bronze and later iron. By the 4th century BCE, Chinese records mention a state called Joseon, later called Joseon, to distinguish it from later dynasties, ruled by kings, fortified with walls, and armed with weapons of bronze. It was here, in the valleys and plains watered by the Taedong River, that the Korean people first took root as a political community. The significance of Joseon is not measured by its power compared to Egypt or Mesopotamia, but by its role in shaping identity. It was the first attempt of the Korean people to unify tribes under law and leadership, to define themselves as a nation distinct from the mighty Chinese empires to the west and the nomadic horsemen to the north. For the Koreans, Joseon was less a kingdom of stone than a kingdom of memory, a beginning. The sources are fragmentary, but they reveal a society already conscious of order and justice. A legal code known as the 8 Prohibitions is attributed to Joseon, prescribing harsh punishments for theft, murder, and adultery. The code reflects a community struggling to impose harmony on fragile bonds of trust to make life predictable in a harsh land. Law, more than conquest, was the foundation of Korean civilization. The advent of iron, around the 4th century BCE, transformed Joseon's economy and warfare. Iron plows allowed deeper tilling of the soil, expanding agriculture beyond the narrow terraces of the mountains. Iron weapons gave warriors new strength to defend against nomadic incursions. For a people hemmed in by geography and neighbors, the mastery of iron was both shield and tool. It gave them the means not to dominate others, but to preserve themselves. Inevitably, Joseon came into conflict with its greater neighbor, China. The Han dynasty viewed the small kingdom with suspicion, especially as it controlled fertile lands and trade routes in Manchuria. In 108 BCE, after a series of wars, Han armies overwhelmed Joseon, establishing commanderies in its place. Yet, even in defeat, the legend of Dangun and the memory of the first Korean state survived. Like seeds buried beneath snow, they would sprout again in later kingdoms. What mattered most was not the scale of Joseon's empire. By global standards, it was small. But the inheritance it passed down, the myth of divine origin, the discipline of law, the skills of agriculture, and the art of survival between giants. Later Koreans would look back to Dangun as their forefather, not merely in blood, but in spirit. Festivals, shrines, and rituals honored him for millennia, a reminder that even the smallest nation could claim a heavenly mandate. If we step briefly into the playful realm of comparison, we might say that Joseon was Korea's dark age in the language of strategy games. Humble, limited, vulnerable. Like a player beginning an age of empires with only a few villagers and a flimsy town center. The Koreans of this era lacked the might of imperial armies or monumental cities, yet within them lay potential. The iron plow, the seeds of rice, The myth of Dangun, the will to endure. Greatness was not immediate, but it was possible. For all its fragility, Joseon endured for centuries, and its memory endured far longer. To this day, school children in Seoul learn the story of Dangun. Temples in the mountains still honor him as a culture hero. In myth and memory, Joseon remains not a relic, but a foundation stone. Without it, the triumphs of Goguryeo, Baekje, Silla, and Joseon would be unmoored, without root or continuity. Every civilization must answer the question, who are we and where did we come from? For Koreans, the answer lay in the union of heaven and earth, of patience and endurance, of myth and law. Joseon was their beginning, not the largest, not the most powerful, but theirs. And sometimes, in history, that is enough. Out of the ruins of Joseon and the fragments of tribal confederations, a new stage of history emerged on the Korean peninsula. By the early centuries of the first millennium, three great powers rose from the soil, each carving out its domain, each vying for dominance. Goguryeo, the northern giant, stern and martial. Baekje, the western kingdom, graceful and cultured. And Silla, the southeastern realm, cautious yet shrewd. Together, they would shape what Koreans later called the Three Kingdoms period. An age of rivalries, alliances, betrayals, and relentless war. The land itself seemed to demand division. The high mountains and winding rivers created natural borders that encouraged regional identity. Goguryeo spread across the northern expanses, embracing both Korea's Upper Peninsula and Manchuria, guarding against nomads and Chinese incursions. Baekje flourished along the fertile Han River basin. Its ports opened to maritime trade with China and Japan. Silla, nestled among the rugged southeastern hills, was the smallest and most isolated, yet protected by geography and strengthened by caution. Each kingdom developed a character that reflected its position. Goguryeo was the hammer. Disciplined, militaristic, its warriors trained for the harsh northern climate and the constant threat of invasion. Mounted archers thundered across the plains, their arrows swift and deadly. The kingdom built massive fortresses of stone, clinging to mountain ridges like eagles' nests, daring invaders to climb and perish. Chinese dynasties dreaded Goguryeo's resilience. It became both shield and spear of the peninsula. Baekje, by contrast, was the brush, refined, cosmopolitan, and artistic. Its proximity to the Yellow Sea and the Han River turned it outward. Baekje sent envoys and monks across the waters, transmitting Buddhism and advanced culture to the Japanese islands, even influencing the architecture and writing of early Japan. The kingdom's artisans mastered elegant sculpture and painting, their works imbued with a grace that revealed not only technical skill, but a love of beauty. If Goguryeo embodied strength, Baekje embodied charm. Silla, at first the weakest, became the fox. Cautious, pragmatic, and gifted in diplomacy. Its mountainous terrain limited expansion, yet gave natural defenses. Silla's rulers compensated for their small size with keen strategy. They nurtured alliances carefully, sometimes with Baekje, sometimes with Goguryeo, and eventually with China itself. In a world of clashing giants, Silla survived by patience and cunning, biding its time until the moment came to strike. The struggle among the three was unending. Armies marched across valleys, laid siege to fortresses, burned villages, and enslaved captives. The peninsula became a chessboard where each move cost lives, and each alliance was temporary. Kingdom rose against kingdom in battles remembered not for decisive victory, but for persistence, for the sheer endurance of peoples unwilling to surrender. Chronicles speak of countless wars. Goguryeo striking south into Baekje, Baekje raiding Silla, Silla appealing for aid from distant Tang emperors. For centuries, the peninsula was never at peace. Yet war, cruel as it was, also forged culture. The kingdoms built walls not only for defense, but as symbols of permanence. They erected palaces and temples, filling them with Buddhist statues and paintings that blended Chinese influence with native sensibilities. Monks translated sutras, scholars wrote histories, and poets sang of love, duty, and loss against the backdrop of battle. Even in bloodshed, creativity persisted, as though the human spirit insisted on beauty even when surrounded by ruin. To imagine this period, one must picture not just armies, but landscapes scarred by fire and rebuilt by hands weary yet determined. Fortresses crowned mountaintops, villages clung to riverbanks, cavalry charges thundered across plains where farmers had sown their fields only weeks before. It was an age when every valley might shift allegiance, every seaport might change hands, every harvest might feed an enemy. And yet, people endured, sowing again, rebuilding again, believing that life was worth preserving even amid chaos. For a modern mind, perhaps the easiest analogy is to think of the three kingdoms as rival factions on a vast game map, each claiming territory, each seeking control of rivers and harbors. Like a strategy game divided into three colors, the peninsula became a living contest, its resources contested, its people caught between shifting front lines. But unlike the neat turns of a game, here the cost was hunger, fire, and death. And the victories were fleeting. Despite the carnage, this tripartite struggle planted seeds for the future. Goguryeo's martial tradition and fortifications laid the foundation for Korea's reputation as a nation of resilient defenders. Baekje's openness to the sea nurtured a legacy of cultural exchange, proving that Korea was never isolated, but a transmitter of civilization. Silla's eventual triumph, achieved not by strength alone, but by diplomacy and patience, foreshadowed a truth of Korean history. Survival often depended less on conquest than on timing, alliances, and endurance. The Three Kingdoms period, then, was more than a contest for territory. It was a crucible in which Korean identity was tested and refined. Here, Koreans learned that strength could take many forms: the arrow of Goguryeo, the brush of Baekje, the wit of Silla. Together, they created a symphony of struggle, a song of wars that echoed across centuries, a reminder that even in division, a people can forge unity of spirit. And so, the peninsula entered its age of iron and blood, of temples and fortresses, of kings who dreamed of unity, yet reigned over fracture. Out of this long discord would one day come a single voice. But before that harmony, there had to be dissonance. And before unity, centuries of strife. This was the song of the Three Kingdoms, sung in the clash of swords and the chanting of monks, in the smoke of battlefields and the glow of lanterns in palaces. It was a harsh song, but it was Korea's. Of the three kingdoms that carved their claims upon the Korean peninsula, Goguryeo was the mightiest in breadth and spirit. From its highland citadels in Manchuria to its fortresses along the northern rivers, Goguryeo grew into a realm so formidable that even the colossal Chinese dynasties of Sui and Tang found themselves humbled before its iron gates. Where Baekje shimmered in art and maritime trade, and Silla plotted patiently with diplomacy, Goguryeo was a mountain of stone and steel, forged by warriors whose very existence seemed a contest with the elements. It was not a gentle land. The northern terrain, cold in winter and unforgiving in soil, taught its people resilience. From these ridges and valleys emerged a kingdom that fused the restless vigor of nomadic horsemen with the discipline of settled farmers. The Goguryeo soldier could mount a horse like the steppe tribes, and yet build walls that rivaled any agrarian empire. Their society was a marriage of mobility and permanence, the gallop of cavalry alongside the steadfast strength of fortresses hewn from rock. The chronicles tell of General Ulji Mundeok, whose genius defeated a million-strong Sui army in the Battle of Salsu, 612 CE. By luring the invaders deep into Goguryeo's terrain and destroying a dam at the river, he drowned most of the enemy in a torrent of water and chaos. It was more than a battle. It was a declaration that Goguryeo would not be subdued, that geography itself conspired with its defenders. Even the mighty Tang, inheritors of China's greatest empire, struggled for decades before they could break Goguryeo's grip. In the annals of East Asia, Goguryeo's stubborn survival became legend. But Goguryeo was not only a fortress. Its culture bore traces of both its nomadic kin and its agricultural heart. Royal tombs reveal murals of vivid colors, warriors in armor, hunters with bows, dancers in flowing robes. These frescoes capture a society both martial and joyful, fierce in war, yet exuberant in life. Their art shows influence from Central Asia, a reminder that Goguryeo stood at a crossroads where trade routes carried silks, horses, and ideas. The kingdom was a bridge between the steppe and the settled civilizations of East Asia, absorbing and reshaping influences into its own form. The fortresses of Goguryeo were marvels of engineering. Built upon cliffs and ridges, these strongholds were designed not just as shelters, but as instruments of endurance. Even today, the remnants of Gungne Fortress and the walls of Hwando stand as silent witnesses to the unyielding spirit of Goguryeo. For centuries they withstood siege after siege, the soldiers behind them armed with iron swords, bows, and a discipline forged in hardship. The image of the Goguryeo warrior, armored, mounted, vigilant, has carried through Korean memory as the archetype of resilience. And in the playful simulations of our age, one may glimpse an echo of that spirit. In Age of Empires the Second, the war wagon, a lumbering fortress on wheels, symbolizes the kingdom's philosophy of defense. Unyielding, relentless, built to endure storms. It is, of course, only a faint shadow, a gamified abstraction. Yet it reminds us that the strength of Goguryeo lay not merely in offense, but in the art of resistance. The ability to weather waves of invasion until the invader himself broke apart. The fall of Goguryeo in 668 CE, after years of joint Tang and Silla pressure, was not a collapse of weakness, but of exhaustion. The kingdom had withstood the impossible for centuries, and only the combined might of diplomacy, betrayal, and overwhelming numbers could bring it low. Yet, in its fall, it gave birth to legends. The memory of generals who defied empires, of citadels that guarded mountains, of warriors who rode like the wind, but stood like stone. In the long story of Korea, Goguryeo remains the epic chapter, a reminder of the grandeur and tragedy that attend every great civilization. Where others might fade quietly, Goguryeo roared until its very end, leaving an imprint not only on the peninsula, but on the imagination of all who have tried to understand how a small kingdom could stand so long against giants. In the long quarrel of the three kingdoms, it was perhaps least expected that Silla, the smallest and most isolated of the three, would be the one to weave the peninsula into unity. Nestled in the southeastern corner of Korea, Silla began not with imperial ambition, but with survival. Surrounded by rivals, short of fertile plains, it seemed destined to be overshadowed by the vast cavalry armies of Goguryeo or the cultured fleets of Baekje. And yet, history is fond of irony. where sheer strength failed, cunning, patience, and vision prevailed. The tale of Scylla's rise is not merely of battles won, but of a people who learned that in diplomacy and faith lay a strength no sword could match. It was through the delicate art of alliance, first with the Tang dynasty of China, that Scylla tipped the balance of power. What Goguryeo resisted with fortress and horsemen, what Baekje polished with its refined art, Scylla outlasted with subtlety and timing. By the late 7th century, it was Scylla that emerged as master of the peninsula, uniting the fractured lands into what history calls the unified Scylla period. But power alone does not bind a people. The unification under Scylla might have dissolved into rebellion and resentment had it relied solely on military victory. What transformed conquest into cohesion was the light of a new faith, Buddhism. Though present earlier, it was during Scylla's ascendancy that Buddhism flourished, not just as a religion, but as the emotional and philosophical glue of the kingdom. Temples rose among the mountains, their wooden halls scented with incense and painted with mandalas. The chants of monks echoed over valleys where once the clash of steel had sounded. The great temple of Bulguksa, with its delicate bridges of stone symbolizing the passage from this world to the Pure Land, embodied the kingdom's aspiration to transcend conflict through harmony. Nearby, in the stillness of grotto and cave, the Seokguram grotto revealed a seated Buddha, serene and eternal, gazing into eternity with eyes half closed, as though in compassion for the suffering of all living beings. In these monuments, one senses not only religion, but the philosophical turn of a civilization. Scylla was telling its people, "We are no longer tribes at war. We are a culture at peace, guided by ideals greater than kings and generals." This faith did not erase ambition or conflict, what faith ever does, but it softened the rough edges of conquest, gave spiritual legitimacy to new rulers, and imbued the land with a new rhythm of life. There was, too, a remarkable social transformation. Scylla developed the Hwarang, an elite corps of aristocratic youth trained in martial skill and imbued with Confucian loyalty and Buddhist compassion. They were warriors, poets, and seekers, symbols of a civilization that sought to unite body and spirit, discipline and beauty. To the common folk, the Hwarang were proof that even in times of hardship, nobility could be lived not only in bloodlines, but in ideals. The era of unified Scylla became a golden age of art. Celadon pottery, elegant yet restrained, reflected the balance of earth and heaven. Buddhist sculptures took on human tenderness, their smiles a quiet rebuke to the cruelties of history. Murals painted on tomb walls depicted dancing figures, reminders that even in a society shaped by hierarchy, joy remained irrepressible. And yet, this golden age was not without shadows. Alliance with Tang China, while useful, also meant the risk of domination. Scylla had to walk the thin line of gratitude and resistance, honoring Chinese culture while asserting its own sovereignty. Internally, the rigid bone rank system, an aristocratic order determining privilege and status, limited social mobility and eventually sowed discontent. But for several centuries, the system held, long enough for Scylla to enjoy relative peace and stability. The world beyond knew this kingdom, not just for its politics, but for its spiritual radiance. Envoys traveled to Tang in Japan, bearing gifts and teachings. Monks journeyed across the seas, carrying sutras and stories. In the cosmopolitan exchanges of East Asia, Scylla was no longer a hidden corner, but a recognized participant in the great conversation of civilizations. One can almost imagine this era in a more familiar metaphor. In the game Age of Empires the Korean civilization is known for its war wagons, massive armored carriages that thunder across the battlefield. Yet the true legacy of Silla was not such armored might, but the war wagon of the mind, a defensive strength built upon faith, art, and diplomacy. Like a fortress that cannot be breached by arrows, Silla's unity rested not only on walls and weapons, but on the deeper fortifications of culture and belief. In modern times, when Koreans look back to Silla, they do not see only a dynasty of kings, but a crucible in which the Korean identity was tempered, spiritual, resilient, and creative. The serene face of the Seokguram Buddha remains one of the enduring icons of Korea, visited by millions, gazed upon in silence, and a reminder that even amid conquest and struggle, a people can choose to define themselves by compassion rather than conquest. Thus, the story of Silla is less about battles than about transformation. A kingdom once hemmed in by rivals became the architect of unity. A people once divided by clan and valley came to see themselves as part of a larger whole. And in the stillness of stone grottos, amid the chanting of monks, one hears not just the echo of a distant past, but the whispered assurance that civilizations, too, are capable of enlightenment. If Silla had woven the peninsula into one cloth, it was Goryeo in 918–1392 that embroidered it with lasting colors. From this dynasty came not only political endurance, but the very name by which the outside world would come to know the land. Korea, derived from Goryeo. To utter that name today is to recall a nation, but in the 10th century, it was still a fragile dream, stitched together by ambition, culture, and the will to survive against impossible odds. Founded by Wang Geon, a general who rose amid the wreckage of the declining Silla, Goryeo inherited both the legacy and the burdens of unification. Its capital at Kaesong grew into a bustling city of palaces, markets, and temples, where merchants from Song China and traders from as far as the Islamic world would pass through. In this vibrant crossroad, Goryeo began to carve an identity of its own, not merely as a pupil of China, nor as a successor to Silla, but as a civilization with its own heartbeat. Few artifacts speak more eloquently of Goryeo than its celadon pottery, with glazes that shimmered in hues of pale green, like jade caught under morning mist. These vessels were not mere objects of utility, but of meditation. Lotus blossoms, cranes in flight, willows swaying in the wind. Such motifs breathed upon clay the serenity of a culture seeking harmony with nature. Even the Chinese, masters of porcelain, marveled at Goryeo's artistry, acknowledging in these ceramics a refinement that rivaled their own. But beauty alone does not sustain a state. Goryeo developed a civil service examination system inspired by Confucian ideals but adapted to local conditions. This meritocratic structure gave literati, scholars of the classics, a pathway to power that balanced, if never entirely erased, the privileges of aristocracy. Alongside it, a body of codified laws sought to regulate disputes, taxes, and responsibilities. These were imperfect instruments. No law is stronger than those who wield it. But they testified to a society moving beyond clan and charisma into institutional governance. Yet no sooner had Goryeo begun to flourish than it faced one of the most terrifying trials in history: the Mongol invasions. Beginning in the 1230s, wave after wave of mounted archers swept down from the north, leaving smoking villages and shattered fortresses in their wake. For decades, Goryeo bent but did not break. Kings and courtiers retreated to the island fortress of Ganghwa, carrying with them the royal court and sacred relics. From there, they resisted the invincible horde with a stubbornness that astonished even their enemies. The chronicles tell of villages razed, of children taken as hostages, of nobles forced into uneasy marriages with Mongol princesses. Yet through all the humiliation, something remarkable endured: the spirit of survival. Unlike so many kingdoms that vanished before the Mongol tide, Goryeo persisted. It compromised, it endured vassalage, it adapted, but it lived. And in living, it preserved the seed of Korea for future generations. One can almost see this era through the lens of a strategy game. Where other kingdoms perished outright before overwhelming cavalry, Goryeo played the long game. Like a player who knows that to win is not always to conquer, but sometimes to outlast. Just as a skilled Age of Empires commander retreats to a fortified island, waiting for the storm to pass, Goryeo's endurance on Ganghwa proved that resilience itself is a form of victory. Amid these trials, Goryeo also gave the world treasures of the spirit. The Tripitaka Koreana, carved onto more than 80,000 wooden blocks in the 13th century, was perhaps the most ambitious publishing project of the medieval world. It was not merely an act of devotion to Buddhism, but an act of defiance. To preserve the Dharma in wood and ink against the flames of invasion. Each character carved with patience was a prayer, a shield, a declaration that culture can resist even when armies fail. It is striking to realize that while Mongol horses trampled fields, Goryeo monks were inscribing eternity onto wood. Such contrasts remind us that civilizations are not defined only by battles fought, but by values chosen when survival is uncertain. What perhaps mattered most for the centuries to come was the name itself. Foreign merchants and envoys, unable to pronounce Goryeo with precision, began to call the land Korea. Like a brand escaping the boundaries of its origin, the name traveled on ships and caravans, fixing itself in the imagination of distant peoples. To call oneself Korean today is thus to wear the inheritance of Goryeo, just as Rome lent its name to Romania, or the Franks to France. The analogy may feel modern, but it is apt. Goryeo succeeded in giving Korea not only endurance, but recognition. In a world where power is fleeting, identity is the ultimate export. Nations rise and fall, but a name endures when it is carried by culture, art, and memory. By the late 14th century, however, Goryeo's vigor waned. Aristocratic factions quarreled. Corruption spread, and peasant uprisings shook the land. The Mongol shadow, though receding, had left scars. Into this weariness stepped new leaders, new visions, who would eventually found the Joseon dynasty. Yet even as Goryeo yielded to its successor, it had already inscribed on history its indelible gifts: the art of Celadon, the resilience of Ganghwa, the Tripitaka blocks, and above all, the name by which its people would forever be known. Thus, the story of Goryeo is not of a perfect kingdom, but of a persevering one. Its beauty, its laws, its compromises, its stubborn survival all converged to forge the vessel of identity. If Silla gave Korea unity, Goryeo gave it recognition. And from that recognition was born a word, Korea, that centuries later would echo across oceans, stadiums, and digital screens, like a timeless brand etched into the memory of humanity. If Goryeo had given the Korean people their name, it was Joseon, 1392-1897, that gave them their soul. For over 5 centuries, a span longer than the Ming or Qing in China, longer than the Ottoman Empire in its prime, Joseon endured, shaping the rhythms of Korean life with Confucian order, ritual, and a quiet revolution in the very alphabet of thought. To speak of Joseon is to step into a civilization both austere and luminous. where etiquette governed the body, but imagination freed the tongue. Founded by General Yi Seong-gye, later King Taejo, Joseon arose not from chaos alone, but from a desire to re-anchor society in moral clarity. The kingdom embraced Confucianism not merely as philosophy, but as the architecture of state and family. The 5 relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend, were codified into law, ritual, and daily expectation. Temples to Confucius stood beside palaces, and the annual rites of scholars reminded rulers that virtue, not might, was the foundation of legitimacy. Education became the pathway to power. The Guazhou civil service examinations, modeled after China's, demanded mastery of the Confucian classics. Success opened the door to officialdom, prestige, and influence. A culture of scholars, Yangban, arose, their lives devoted to calligraphy, philosophy, and debate. While aristocracy lingered, meritocracy gleamed within it, at least in theory. The brush might elevate a man as much as the sword. And yet, Confucianism was not only a means of governance, but a vision of harmony. Ceremonies marked the stages of life: birth, marriage, mourning, ancestral worship, reminding each generation that they were links in a chain stretching backward and forward. To live in Joseon was to breathe within this rhythm of reverence, where even the act of bowing carried centuries of meaning. But perhaps the greatest gift of Joseon was not in governance or ritual, but in the creation of Hangul. In 1443, under the reign of King Sejong the Great, a group of scholars devised a new script unlike any other. At a time when the Chinese characters, Hanja, dominated the elite, Hangul was deliberately simple, phonetic, and democratic. Its consonants were shaped after the organs of speech, its vowels after cosmic principles of heaven, earth, and man. It was not just a system of writing. It was a philosophy of accessibility. For centuries, literacy had been the privilege of the few, the aristocrats and scholars who mastered thousands of Chinese ideographs. But Hangul, elegant in its logic, could be learned by commoners in days. King Sejong himself declared that he wished to give a script to those who had been voiceless, so that even a woman or a child might read and write. One might liken Hangul to the arrival of a new technology upgrade in a strategy game. Where once knowledge was locked behind an expensive building or rare resource, suddenly it became universally accessible. Hangul democratized thought, spreading literacy like a wildfire through classes that had long been excluded. What the printing press did for Europe, Hangul did for Korea. It amplified the voice of the people. Ironically, the very Confucian elite that presided over Joseon were hesitant, even resistant to Hangul. Many scholars considered it vulgar, a script for women and commoners, unfit for the dignity of classics. Official documents and examinations continued to rely on Chinese characters. Yet the people quietly adopted Hangul, using it for letters, diaries, songs, and folk tales. Over centuries, it became not merely a supplement, but the very essence of Korean cultural identity. This paradox defined Joseon, a state rigid in hierarchy, yet a society fertile with creativity. Confucianism sought to regulate passion, but Hangul gave language to passion's voice. The Yangban painted landscapes of mountains and rivers, yet farmers and poets composed folk songs that still echo in Korea's heritage today. Outwardly austere, inwardly vibrant, such was the dual nature of Joseon's civilization. Over its 5 centuries, Joseon weathered invasions, famines, and internal strife. Samurai armies from Japan burned cities in the late 16th century. Manchu horsemen later exacted submission. Yet Joseon's cultural spine held firm. Kings rose and fell, factions plotted, but the rituals of Confucian order and the flowing lines of Hangul continued to bind the people together. From a distance, the longevity of Joseon may resemble the calm plateau in a strategy campaign. After the chaos of earlier ages, a civilization that endures by building walls of ritual and towers of learning. Yet beneath that calm, a profound transformation was taking place. For the first time, the ordinary villager, the merchant, the mother, the child, could read their own tongue. And in that democratization lay the seed of a modern nation. When Joseon finally gave way to the modern pressures of the 19th century, it left behind more than palaces and scrolls. It left a way of life, the bow of respect, the emphasis on education, the reverence for ancestors, and above all, the alphabet that gave every Korean a voice. Today, Hangul is celebrated each October 9th as a national holiday. Linguists hail it as one of the most logical scripts ever devised. But for Korea, it is more than a tool of communication. It is a symbol of equality. Sejong's vision, resisted by his own elites, triumphed across centuries to become the beating heart of modern Korean identity. Thus, Joseon, with its Confucian rigidity and its revolutionary script, was both guardian of tradition and midwife of transformation. It gave Korea 500 years of stability. And it gave the world an alphabet born not of conquest, but of compassion. In this, perhaps, lies Joseon's greatest achievement: to prove that the mightiest empire is not one that silences its people, but one that teaches them to speak. If Joseon had built its longhouse on the pillars of Confucian order and the blessing of Hangul, then the late 16th century struck that house with fire and steel. The sea carried not traders or scholars this time, but the black sails of an invasion. Japan, under the ambitions of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, cast its gaze across the straits, dreaming of conquering Ming China through Korea as the bridge. What followed was the Imjin War, 1592-1598, a nightmare seared into the Korean soul, yet also a tale of unbreakable defiance. The Japanese armies landed with muskets that spat thunder, their ranks drilled and hungry for conquest. Cities fell, palaces burned, civilians fled to mountains, and temples once filled with chants were left to smolder. For the Joseon court, steeped in ritual and classical texts, the sudden collision with the modernity of gunpowder warfare felt like a storm descending upon a scholar's study. Yet it was in this hour of calamity that Korea found one of its eternal heroes, Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Yi was not born of wealth, nor was he favored by politics. But he possessed a rare clarity of mind, a devotion to his people, and a genius for naval strategy that would earn him immortality. Facing overwhelming odds, with fleets outnumbered and resources scarce, Yi turned to invention and daring. His answer was the Gyeobukseon, the turtle ship. Clad in iron spikes, with a dragon's head breathing cannon fire at its bow, this vessel was as much psychological weapon as machine of war. When it emerged on the misty waters, enemy sailors swore it was a sea beast rising from the deep. Time after time, against fleets many times larger, Yi held the line. His diaries reveal a man torn between despair at betrayal in court politics and an unshakable duty to defend his homeland. At Myeongnang in 1597, with only 13 ships, he faced more than 300 Japanese vessels. It was a moment when mathematics itself seemed to surrender. But Yi turned the treacherous currents of the strait into his ally, luring the enemy into chaos and striking with precision. The Japanese fleet shattered. Korea still breathed. This was more than military triumph. It was a revelation that courage, ingenuity, and unyielding will could balance scales tilted by power and technology. Yi never lost a naval battle. He died in combat, struck by a bullet in the final battle of Noryang, whispering that his death be concealed until victory was secure. Few men in history lived and died so completely as symbols of their nation's resilience. The land, meanwhile, bore scars beyond counting. Villages lay in ashes, fields ruined, families scattered. Yet amid ruin, seeds of survival were sown. The war taught Korea that its identity could not be extinguished by fire, that even if palaces fell, the spirit of the people endured. Here lies the paradox of tragedy. It destroys, yet also forges. In the crucible of Imjin, the Korean soul tempered itself like steel. To the modern imagination, this era might echo scenes from cinema. The flaming arrows, the thunder of cannon, the lone commander standing at his deck as storm and enemy converged. In the digital age, one may even glimpse Yi Sun-sin's shadow in the naval supremacy of the Koreans in Age of Empires the Second, where their warships rule the seas. That is no accident of design. It is history translated into play, memory disguised as mechanics. Games and films dramatize, but the truth was already dramatic beyond invention. And so, when we speak of Korea's survival, we must remember that it was not an easy endurance. The Imjin War burned libraries and lives, erased generations of art and labor. Yet from its smoke arose a lesson repeated through centuries. Korea can be invaded, ravaged, even silenced for a time, but never erased. Admiral Yi's statue today stands tall in Seoul, not as a relic, but as a living reminder. The turtle ship may rest in museums, but the spirit that launched it still sails in the hearts of Koreans. For in the end, wars are not merely contests of arms, but of memory. Those who endure write the next chapter, and Korea, though wounded, moved forward to rebuild, to create, to live. The fire of the 16th century, like so many fires before and after, did not consume the nation. It lit instead the forge of resilience that would carry it through the storms of modern times. When the drums of war finally faded, what endured was not only the memory of battles, but the quiet pulse of daily life. A civilization cannot live forever on swords. It must nourish itself with ideas, with crafts, with the intimate arts of healing and creation. Korea, though often tested by invasions, proved that its true resilience lay not merely in fortresses and fleets, but in the mind and the spirit of its people. The physicians of Joseon recorded volumes of medical knowledge, blending the rigor of Confucian scholarship with folk remedies passed down through generations. They sought to understand the body as a microcosm of nature. Blood as rivers, organs as mountains, breath as wind. Through herbs, acupuncture, and careful diagnosis, they brought comfort in an age when disease was as fearsome as any army. Above them, astronomers raised their eyes to the heavens. They charted the sun and the moon, tracked the paths of constellations, and carved their findings into stone. The Keomseongdae Observatory, still standing today, is one of the oldest surviving in the world, a monument not to conquest, but to curiosity. To measure time, ingenious minds built water clocks, steady streams marking the hours long before the mechanical tick-tock of Europe reached the peninsula. Here was proof that even under pressure of foreign empires, Koreans sought mastery not just of land, but of time itself. Art blossomed in humbler, but no less enduring forms. Wood blocks carved with painstaking care pressed ink onto paper. giving birth to books that carried ideas across generations. Centuries before Gutenberg's press reshaped Europe, Korea had already experimented with movable metal type, producing printed works that democratized knowledge far beyond the scholar's desk. In a world where literacy was often the privilege of the elite, the Korean press hinted at a future where learning could belong to the many. The artisans of the land turned clay into radiance. Celadon, with its soft green glaze like water under a spring sky, was more than pottery. It was philosophy made visible. Its perfection of form and hue captured a harmony between earth and spirit, simplicity and elegance. To hold a Goryeo Celadon vase was to hold a piece of eternity, fragile yet unyielding, like the civilization itself. Life, of course, was not only invention and artistry. It was also rhythm and ritual. Poets composed verses that sang of mountains and rivers, of loyalty and longing. Painters brushed silk with images of lotus blossoms, cranes, and sweeping landscapes, symbols of purity, longevity, and peace. Music echoed in the courts, blending Chinese instruments with native melodies, creating a sound that was distinctly Korean, restrained yet powerful, meditative yet alive. In these quieter achievements, we glimpse the true genius of Korea, the ability to endure by creating, to resist oblivion by crafting beauty and meaning in the face of hardship. Even as armies trampled their soil, Koreans built a universe of their own, where science met poetry and daily life was elevated by the pursuit of wisdom. And here, perhaps, the modern reader finds the bridge to today. For is it not the same spirit that fuels the Korea of the 21st century? From K-pop rhythms that sweep the globe, to films and dramas that speak to universal hearts, to cutting-edge technology that shapes our digital age. The old flame of invention and artistry still burns. The woodblock printer's hand can be seen in the coder's keystroke. The Celadon potter's touch lingers in the designer's craft. If one wished to imagine this in the playful language of a strategy game, Korea's civilization bonus was never only its war wagons or turtle ships, but its persistent creativity, the quiet edge that transformed adversity into advancement. Just as in Age of Empires, where a small upgrade can tip the balance of power, Korea's true upgrade was not martial, but intellectual. The mastery of knowledge and the devotion to culture. Thus, when we speak of Korean civilization, we must remember not only Yi Sun-sin's valor on the seas, or Goguryeo mighty cavalry, but also the patient astronomer marking the stars, the humble craftsman carving blocks of wood, the scholar designing letters so that even peasants might read. In their silent labor lies the heartbeat of a nation. A reminder that the greatest defense against time is not the sword, but the story, not the fortress, but the idea. From the dawn of legend, when Dangun was said to have founded the first Korean kingdom beneath the watchful gaze of heaven, to the neon glow of Seoul in our present age, Korea's story stretches like a river, narrow at its source, gathering strength and breadth until it pours into the sea of world civilization. The journey is long, often tragic, yet unbroken. The legacy of this people cannot be measured in mere borders or conquests. Korea was never the largest empire on the map, nor the most fearsome in its armies. But what it lacked in size, it repaid with a spirit of endurance that no storm could extinguish. From the burning villages of the Imjin War to the decades of Mongol resistance, from colonial oppression to the struggle for survival in the modern industrial age, the Korean nation repeatedly stood at history's crossroads, battered yet never broken. At the heart of this legacy lies an unyielding resilience. To outsiders, Korea seemed like a land perpetually caught between great powers, China to the west, Japan to the east, nomadic hordes from the north. Yet within, a quiet steel was forged. Each invasion, each occupation, was met not only with arms, but with an unshakable cultural will. Out of suffering grew creativity. Hangul was born so that even the humblest farmer could learn to read. Celadon pottery was perfected to embody elegance amid hardship. Poetry and song flourished even when the land itself was scarred. Hangul, perhaps, stands as the most luminous jewel in this heritage. Created in the 15th century, it gave the people their own voice, free from the confines of borrowed scripts. It democratized knowledge, binding the nation with a shared literacy that became both shield and sword. In its simple logical strokes lies a profound act of resistance, the refusal to let identity be swallowed by the tides of empire. Equally enduring are the memories of those who defended the land with their lives. Admiral Yi Sun-sin's turtle ships sail eternally through the imagination, symbols of ingenuity and defiance. Generals and kings, scholars and poets, peasants and rebels, all left imprints of courage that became a collective inheritance. Their names may echo differently through the centuries, but the spirit they embodied remains constant. That a people's worth is not measured by the size of their armies, but by the depth of their endurance and the brilliance of their culture. This is why Korea today stands as more than a modern state. It is a living testament to the capacity of small nations to shape the world. In technology, in film, in music, in cuisine, Korea's influence radiates far beyond its peninsula. K-pop concerts fill stadiums from Los Angeles to Paris. Korean dramas captivate audiences across continents. Samsung and Hyundai shape the tools of the digital age. What began as survival has become triumph. What was once a struggle for recognition has become a voice heard everywhere. In a sense, the story resembles the arc of a strategy game. In Age of Empires: The Sioux, the Korean civilization does not dominate in the opening moves. Their early economy is modest, their initial armies less overwhelming. But as the match progresses, their strength becomes clear. Sturdy defenses, unmatched naval power, and units that grow harder to defeat the longer they endure. By the late game, they are a force almost impossible to uproot. So it has been with Korea itself. A nation that may not have started with the world's grandest empires, but which endured every trial until endurance became victory. Thus, the meaning of Korea's history is not confined to its peninsula. It speaks to all peoples who feel small beside great neighbors, who face odds that seem insurmountable. It whispers that survival itself can be a form of greatness, that cultural creativity can outlast swords and empires. From the humble myths of Dangun to the skyscrapers of Seoul, Korea tells us that no nation is too small to leave a vast legacy, provided it guards its spirit with fidelity. And so we close this journey with a paradox. A civilization modest in land, but vast in memory, often threatened, yet never erased. A culture born from resilience, whose influence now stretches across the globe. Joseon, Goryeo, Joseon, Korea. The names may change, the borders may shift, but the essence remains. It is the essence of a people who turned hardship into harmony and survival into triumph. Korea's true empire is not carved into maps, but into minds and hearts. And so the story of Korea closes not as an ending, but as a chapter in the great book of civilizations. If this journey moved you, if you felt the heartbeat of history echo through the battles, the inventions, and the spirit of a people who refuse to vanish, then I invite you to walk further with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our ongoing voyage through the rise and fall of civilizations. Many more worlds await. Empires of warriors and philosophers, builders and dreamers, victories and tragedies. Together, we will uncover how humanity has risen, stumbled, and endured. The story continues. Will you walk with us?